Hey, class. Today we are talking about World War One still. We're talking about something that happened during World War One that just doesn't happen often. Uh, there was a Christmas truce in 1914. It was the year after, or year that the war began. And what I mean by truce, they stopped fighting. They stopped fighting. They celebrated Christmas with each other, and it's just something you don't see very often, especially during the war. So it's kind of a memorable moment in history because of that. The Christmas truce of 1914 is one of the most interesting events that occurred during World War One. Uh, in the midst of war and fighting, soldiers along the Western Front they stopped fighting in an unofficial ceasefire on Christmas.
What was it? The Christmas truce of 1914 is one of the most interesting events that occurred during World War I. In the midst of war and fighting, soldiers along the Western Front stopped fighting in an unofficial ceasefire on Christmas.
And when I say it was unofficial, I mean there wasn't anything that said, "Hey, let's do this. Let's sign a document or let's sign a treaty saying we're going to do this." It just kind of happened, and it all started with some singing, uh, and British between British and German soldiers. It all started that way. So uh, it took place along the Western Front in France, where Germans were fighting both the British and the French. And like I said, it wasn't an official ceasefire. It wasn't saying, "Hey, we're going to stop right now." All right, it was different along different points of the front. In some places, the soldiers they kept fighting, all right, because it wasn't official. But in many areas, they stopped fighting. They agreed to a temporary truce. This was the soldiers agreeing to a temporary truce, not the people in charge of the soldiers, not the higher ups, right? So this was just the soldiers that agreed to it.
Where did the truce take place? The truce took place along the Western Front in France, where the Germans were fighting both the British and the French. Since it wasn't an official ceasefire, the truce was different along different points of the front. In some places, the soldiers continued to fight, but in many areas, they stopped fighting and agreed to a temporary truce.
All right. So what did the soldiers do during this temporary truce? A lot of them behaved differently. They did different things. It probably depended on their local commander. What did their local commander allow them to do? In some areas, the soldiers they just stopped fighting for the day. All right, they didn't get together. They didn't hang out. But in other areas, they agreed to let each other recover their dead. And at some points along the front, it almost appeared like the war was over because soldiers from each side they met and they talked to each other. They gave each other Christmas gifts. They shared food. They sang Christmas carols. They even played games of soccer with each other, like you see right here in this picture above. So it just depended on what area you were in and what their local commander allowed them to do.
What did the soldiers do? Along all the Western Front, the soldiers behaved differently. It probably depended on what their local commander allowed them to do. In some areas, the soldiers just stopped fighting for the day. In other areas, they agreed to let each other recover their dead. However, at some points along the front, it was almost appeared like the war was over. Soldiers from each side met and talked to each other. They gave each other gifts, shared food, sang Christmas carols, and even played games of soccer with each other.
All right, so how did it start? All right, in many areas, the truce began when German troops they began to light candles and sing Christmas carols, and soon the British troops were on the other side of no man's land, but they could hear them singing, and so they began to join in and sing on their own carols, doing their own Christmas carols, and then there were soldiers that would get up and they were brave enough to make their way into the area between the two lines that was called no man's land. This would be a picture of no man's land right here. All right. You didn't want to get out in between the trenches. All right. Because if you got out in between the trenches, bad things could happen. You'd get shot. You could step on landmines, etc. Okay. If just you just didn't do that. All right. So they met up with enemy soldiers though to exchange gifts and souvenirs. So it was different along each thing, but that's how it began. German troops were singing some carols, some Christmas carols. British soldiers heard them. They started singing with them, and then one thing led to another. and they were going out to meet each other.
How did it start? In many areas, the truce began when German troops began to light candles and sing Christmas carols. Soon, British troops across the lines began to join in or sing their own carols. Brave soldiers began to make their way into the area between the two lines called No Man's Land. They met up with enemy soldiers to exchange gifts and souvenirs.
All right, so some of the generals and the leaders, they didn't want them to engage in this unofficial truce, okay? And the reason being is because they didn't want them to, once this truce was over, once, to have any kind of different feeling. They wanted them, hey, I have to fight this person. All right, you have to fight him. We don't want you being friends with him and you having to fight him because things might go differently. So both sides, on both Germans and British and French, I all said, you shouldn't fraternize or communicate with the enemy. And the generals were afraid that this would cause the soldiers to be less aggressive, all right, once the fighting began again. So in future years of the war, truces at Christmas, they were much more guarded. It basically stopped by 1917, which was getting close to the end of the war. This is what one of it might have looked like, some of the Christmas truce there.
Response. Some of the generals and leaders didn't want the soldiers to engage in an unofficial truce. Orders came down from the commanders on both sides that the soldiers should not fraternize or communicate with the enemy. The generals were afraid that this would cause the soldiers to be less aggressive in future engagements. In future years of the war, truces at Christmas were much more guarded, and it basically stopped by 1917.
All right, so here's some facts about the Christmas truce. In an attempt to stop the truces and communication with German soldiers, British High Command, they issued a warning to the officers that the Germans were going to attack on Christmas. So they didn't want them fraternized, didn't want them talking with the Germans. So they tried to trick them, tell them, hey, they were going to attack on Christmas. So that's how they felt about it. They did not want them having a truce and being friendly with the enemy.
Facts about the Christmas truce. In an attempt to stop the truces and communication with German soldiers, British High Command issued a warning to officers that Germans were going to attack on Christmas.
All right, so comprehension question. During what war did the Christmas truce take place? Was A, the Civil War, B, World War I, or C, the American Revolution? It was B, World War I. World War I is what we're talking about.
Ding, ding, ding. We have a winner.
Number two, what year did the first Christmas truce occur? Was it in A, 1960, B, 2018, or C, 1914? It was C, 1914, the first year that the war had begun, first year of the war.
Ding, ding, ding. We have a winner.
Number three, what was the area between the trenches of the two enemy sides called? It called A, the kill zone, B, the playground, or C, no man's land? It was C, no man's land. That is the game we play in class. No Man's Land, when that's our review game for the week. That's the name of it.
Ding, ding, ding. We have a winner.
Number four, what was something the soldiers did at the Christmas truce? A, they played basketball. B, they played soccer. Or C, they did nothing. B, some of them played soccer. They played games at the Christmas truce.
Ding, ding, ding. We have a winner.
Number five, what did the British High Command do to try to stop the truces? A, nothing. B, they issued warnings that the Germans would attack. Or C, they took pictures with them. The British High Command did not want them to communicate with the enemy. They didn't want them being friendly with them. So they issued warnings that the Germans would attack in hopes of trying to stop this truce.
Ding, ding, ding. We have a winner.
All right, class, that is it for the Christmas truce. We'll be back with more World War I with the next time, and I will see you all then. Have a very good day.